Sometimes the people who know us best are the ones we can trust the least. Elena Vasquez pressed her back against the rotting timber of the old logging cabin as rain hammered the Cascade Mountains like gunfire. 7 months pregnant and soaked to the bone, she clutched the flash drive containing evidence that would destroy her husband's family, if she lived long enough to use it. The Mendoza construction dynasty had built half of Portland, but their fortune was built on blood money, and now they wanted her silenced forever. She'd stumbled onto this forgotten logging camp purely by accident, fleeing through the storm when her car ran out of gas. But when she discovered the hidden vault beneath the cabin's floorboards, accident seemed too simple a word. $375 million in bearer bonds and gold bars lay stacked in pristine condition, protected by technology that shouldn't exist in a place abandoned since the 1940s. The vault's biometric scanner had read her palm like an old friend. Security footage revealed a woman Elena recognized. Her mother, supposedly dead for 24 years, visiting this vault regularly until 2019. As Elena stared at the impossible evidence, one question burned through her mind. Had her entire life been a lie? And was her unborn child the next piece in a puzzle she was only beginning to understand? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The security monitor's green glow cast sickly shadows across Elena's face as she stared at footage that shattered everything she thought she knew. Her mother, Maria Vasquez, dead at 31 in a car accident, moved through the vault with practiced efficiency, checking inventory, updating ledgers, her movements those of someone intimately familiar with every inch of the space. Elena's hands trembled as she scrolled through the timestamps. 2008, 2011, 2015. The last entry, March 15, 2019. Just 4 months before Elena married Carlos Mendoza. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as if sensing her distress. She pressed a palm to her swollen belly, trying to steady her breathing. The vault's air recycling system hummed quietly, a sound that spoke of maintenance, of care, of secrets, kept alive long after they should have died. On the monitor, her mother's face turned toward the camera in one clip. Those same dark eyes Elena saw in the mirror every morning, the same stubborn jawline. But this woman moved with a confidence Elena had never possessed, a predatory grace that belonged to someone who lived in shadows. Thunder crashed overhead, and Elena flinched. How long had she been down here? An hour? 3? Time felt elastic in this underground tomb of secrets. She needed to move, needed to think, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The flash drive in her pocket, the evidence of the Mendoza family's money laundering operation, suddenly felt insignificant. She'd thought she was uncovering a simple case of construction industry corruption, invoices for materials never delivered, subcontractors that existed only on paper, a network funneling cartel money through legitimate development projects. She'd been so proud of herself for connecting the dots, for seeing the pattern that had eluded federal investigators for years, even 7 months pregnant. Even with Carlos growing increasingly possessive and his mother's cold stares following her through their Laurelhurst mansion, she'd pushed forward with her investigation. The irony tasted bitter now. While she'd been hunting the Mendoza secrets, apparently the Vasquez secrets had been hunting her. A new video file caught her attention. The timestamp read December 2000. Elena would have been 6, barely a year after her mother's supposed death. Her finger hovered over the play button. Some knowledge once gained could never be unknowable. She clicked. The vault looked exactly the same, down to the precise arrangement of gold bars. But the woman on screen wasn't her mother. This figure was older, silver-haired, moving with the same predatory confidence. She was speaking to someone off camera, her lips forming words the ancient audio system couldn't capture clearly. Elena cranked the volume. Static-laden fragments drifted through the speakers. Subject shows exceptional aptitude. Genetic markers confirm. Timing of the insertion must be precise. The woman held up a file folder. Even through the grainy footage, Elena could make out the tab label, Elena Vasquez, Project Genesis. Her blood turned to ice water. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Elena's hand flew to her belly. Project Genesis, the timing of the insertion must be precise. She thought of Carlos's sudden romantic pursuit 3 years ago, how he'd swept into her life just as she'd been feeling isolated after finishing her forensic accounting certification. How perfectly he'd seemed to understand her, anticipate her needs. How insistent he'd been about starting a family immediately after their wedding. A new sound penetrated her consciousness, engines in the distance growing closer, multiple vehicles navigating the treacherous mountain roads despite the storm. Elena's chest tightened. The Mendoza family had resources, connections in law enforcement, tracking capabilities that could locate a cell phone even when it was turned off. She'd been a fool to think the mountains would protect her. Moving with sudden urgency, Elena began photographing everything, the gold bars, the bearer bonds, the security footage still playing on the monitors. Her phone's camera flash strobed through the vault like lightning, creating a surreal catalogue of impossible wealth and impossible truths. The engine sounds grew louder, definitely multiple vehicles, and they were close enough now that she could hear doors slamming through the storm. Elena pocketed her phone and moved toward the vault's exit. The steel ladder leading back to the cabin felt slick under her palms, and climbing it with her pregnant belly proved awkward. But adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She emerged through the hidden floor panel into the cabin's main room, just as headlight beams swept across the windows. 3 black SUVs had arranged themselves in a semicircle around the building, their occupants already deploying into the rain. Elena recognized Carlos's voice calling her name through the storm, but the tone held no warmth, no relief. It was the voice of a hunter who'd cornered his prey. She pressed her back against the wall beside the window and closed her eyes, one hand on her belly, the other clutching evidence that might mean nothing or everything. Whatever came next, she was no longer just Elena Vasquez, forensic accountant and betrayed wife. She was Project Genesis, and they were coming for their investment. The pounding on the cabin door started 30 seconds later, methodical, patient, the rhythm of someone who knew their quarry had nowhere to run. Elena. Carlos's voice cut through the storm with practiced calm. I know you're in there. Your car's outside, and frankly, there's nowhere else to go for 20 miles. She slid down the wall until she was sitting, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. The floor panel to the vault had sealed seamlessly, no visible trace of the underground chamber that had just rewritten her entire existence. Above her, rain hammered the roof with increasing fury, but it couldn't drown out the sound of boots circling the cabin. We just want to talk, Carlos continued. His tone was the same one he'd used during their courtship, when he'd show up at her downtown Portland office with coffee and pastries, charming her colleagues while he waited for her to finish reviewing financial statements. Back when she'd thought his persistence was romantic instead of calculated. Elena pressed her palms against her temples, trying to organize the chaos in her mind. 3 months ago, she'd been living what she thought was a fairy tale, married to a successful contractor, pregnant with their first child, living in a beautiful home in one of Portland's most exclusive neighborhoods. Her biggest concern had been whether the nursery's paint fumes were safe for the baby. The life she'd built felt impossibly distant now, like viewing someone else's memories through thick glass. Had any of it been real? Their first date at Le Pigeon, where Carlos had listened intently as she explained her work tracing financial irregularities for insurance companies. The way he'd laughed at her dry observations about corporate malfeasance, calling her his beautiful detective. Their wedding at the Mendoza family estate, where his mother had smiled coldly while placing a family heirloom necklace around Elena's throat, a gesture that had felt more like a claiming than a welcoming. Even their intimate moments felt tainted now. Carlos's hands on her body, his whispered promises about their future children, the way he'd insisted they start trying for a baby immediately after the honeymoon. Had he been following a script, executing a plan that someone else had written? Elena, please. A different voice now. Carlos's younger brother Miguel, whom she'd actually liked during family gatherings. It's freezing out here, and this storm's getting worse. Whatever you think you've discovered, we can work it out. The baby shifted inside her, a rolling movement that made her gasp 7 months along, and she'd been so excited about becoming a mother, about creating the kind of loving family she'd never had after losing her parents so young. She'd spent hours researching cribs and car seats, reading parenting books, imagining bedtime stories and soccer games and first days of school. Now she wondered if her child was meant to be a person at all, or just the next phase of Project Genesis. More footsteps outside, the crunch of boots on gravel barely audible above the storm. They were positioning themselves around the cabin's perimeter, professional and patient. Elena closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time she'd felt truly safe. Maybe her childhood with her grandmother in Salem, before the old woman's death had left 15-year-old Elena to navigate the foster system alone. That early loss had made Carlos's family seem like salvation, people who wanted to include her, protect her, give her the sense of belonging she'd craved for years. The irony was savage. She'd been so hungry for family that she'd walked straight into a trap designed specifically for her. A new sound made her freeze, the soft scrape of metal against wood. Someone was working on the door's lock. Elena's grandmother had taught her basic survival skills during camping trips to these same mountains, lessons that had seemed like games at the time. Find shelter, conserve energy, trust your instincts. Right now, every instinct was screaming that the men outside weren't here to take her home safely. She thought about her downtown Portland office, with its view of the Willamette River and walls lined with certificates from financial crimes investigations. Her desk drawer still contained the business cards of FBI agents who'd consulted with her on complex fraud cases, people who'd trusted her analytical mind, her ability to see patterns others missed. But none of those connections could help her now, not when she didn't know how deep this conspiracy reached or who else might be compromised. The evidence on her phone felt both crucial and useless, proof of something enormous. But she had no idea who to trust with it. The lock clicked open. Elena's hand moved instinctively to her belly as the door creaked inward. Whatever happened next would determine not just her fate, but the future of the child growing inside her, a child who might be the culmination of a plan decades in the making. The ordinary world she'd known for 29 years was about to end forever. The door swung open with deliberate slowness, revealing Carlos silhouetted against the storm. Rain lashed at his expensive jacket, but his dark hair remained perfectly styled. Even fleeing into the mountains to hunt down his pregnant wife, he maintained the polished appearance that had first attracted her attention 3 years ago. Behind him, Elena could make out at least 4 other figures, their faces obscured by the darkness and driving rain. "There you are." Carlos stepped across the threshold, water dripping from his coat onto the cabin's worn wooden floor. His smile was the same one he'd worn on their wedding day, warm and possessive. "You had us worried, querida, driving alone in your condition, in weather like this." Elena remained seated against the wall, her hands still pressed protectively over her belly. The hidden vault lay mere feet below them, its secrets burning in her pocket alongside the flash drive that had started this nightmare. She forced herself to meet his gaze, searching for any trace of the man she'd thought she'd married. "How did you find me?" Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Carlos's smile widened, but the warmth never reached his eyes. "Your phone, of course. Even turned off, it pings cell towers. Basic technology, Elena. I thought someone with your investigative skills would know that." Miguel appeared in the doorway behind his brother, his usually jovial face tight with concern. "Elena, what's this about? Carlos said you'd stolen something from his office, but that doesn't sound like you." The question hung in the air like a lifeline. Miguel had always been different from the rest of the Mendoza family, less calculating, more genuinely kind. During family dinners, he'd been the one to ask about her work, to listen when she explained the intricate financial puzzles she solved for a living. If anyone might help her, it would be him. But then she noticed the earpiece he was wearing, nearly invisible against his dark hair. Whatever conversation was happening here, someone else was listening. "I found the invoices," Elena said carefully, watching Carlos's expression. "The ones for materials that were never delivered. Payment records for companies that don't exist. Millions of dollars moving through your construction projects." Carlos nodded slowly, as if she were a student who'd finally grasped a difficult concept. "Yes, you did find those. Very thorough work, actually. My mother always said you had exceptional analytical abilities." The casual mention of his mother sent ice through Elena's veins. Victoria Mendoza, with her cold intelligence and the way she watched Elena like a scientist observing an experiment. Had she known? Had she been part of this from the beginning? "But that's not why we're here," Carlos continued, taking another step into the cabin. "You found something else tonight, didn't you? Something that made you run instead of calling the authorities about those invoices." Elena's phone felt heavy in her pocket, loaded with photographs of impossible wealth and security footage that rewrote her entire history. The images of her supposedly dead mother moving through the underground vault with practiced efficiency, the elderly woman discussing Project Genesis while holding a file with Elena's name on it. "I don't know what you mean," she said. Carlos laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Come now, Elena. We both know you're far too intelligent for that approach. You discovered something tonight that scared you enough to drive 3 hours into the mountains during a storm while 7 months pregnant, something that made you question everything." Lightning illuminated the cabin's interior, throwing harsh shadows across Carlos's face. In that brief, stark moment, Elena saw him clearly for the first time, not the charming contractor who'd swept her off her feet, but something predatory and patient. Someone who'd been playing a role for years. "The question," Carlos said, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper, "is what you plan to do with that information." Miguel shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "Carlos, maybe we should—" "Miguel." The single word from Carlos cut off his brother's protest with surgical precision. "Wait outside." Elena watched Miguel's face cycle through confusion, concern, and finally resignation before he stepped back into the storm. The sound of the rain seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the tension crackling through the cabin's stale air. They were alone now, husband and wife, predator and prey, the culmination of a plan that had been in motion since before Elena was born. Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly, where her child continued its restless movement, oblivious to the forces that might already have determined its destiny. "So," Carlos said, closing the door behind him and turning the lock with deliberate finality, "why don't you tell me what you really found tonight?" Elena stared up at him, acutely aware that her next words would determine whether she and her baby lived through the night. The ordinary world, her job, her marriage, her carefully constructed life, had already crumbled beyond recognition. Now she faced a choice that would define everything that came after. Trust the man she'd loved, or trust the evidence that suggested her entire existence had been a lie. Elena's mind raced, each heartbeat echoing like thunder in her ears. The locked door between her and Miguel felt like a death sentence, sealing her alone with a man she no longer recognized. Carlos stood silhouetted against the storm-darkened window, his expensive suit incongruous in the rustic cabin, waiting for her answer with the patience of someone who held all the cards. "What you really found tonight?" The words circled her thoughts like vultures. How much did he know? Had they been watching her discover the vault, photographing the evidence that now burned in her pocket? Or was this a fishing expedition, Carlos probing to see how much damage control was needed? "I found financial records," she said carefully, her forensic training kicking in despite her terror. "Start with partial truth. Gauge the reaction, evidence of money laundering through your family's construction projects." Carlos's expression didn't change. "We established that already, querida. I'm talking about what sent you running into the mountains instead of straight to the FBI." The casual way he dismissed federal law enforcement chilled her, as if the FBI were merely an inconvenience, not a genuine threat. How deep did this conspiracy reach? How many people were compromised? Elena's hand moved protectively over her belly, and she felt the baby respond with a flutter of movement. 7 months of growing this child, of dreaming about their future together, of imagining herself as the kind of mother she'd never had. Now those dreams felt like someone else's script, carefully written to manipulate her into compliance. "You're scaring me," she whispered, and the admission felt like bleeding. "Good." Carlos moved closer, and she caught his familiar scent, expensive cologne mixed with rain. Once, that smell had meant safety, passion, home. Now it triggered every survival instinct she possessed. Fear means you're finally understanding the stakes. What stakes? "Carlos, I don't—" "Stop!" His voice cut through her protests like a blade. "You found the vault, Elena. We both know it. The question is whether you're going to cooperate or whether this becomes complicated." The vault. He knew about the underground chamber, knew she'd discovered it, which meant they'd been monitoring her somehow, or the facility had security measures she hadn't detected. Elena's throat constricted as she remembered the biometric scanner that had recognized her handprint, the footage of her supposedly dead mother moving through those same corridors with practiced familiarity. "How long have you been lying to me?" The question escaped before she could stop it, raw and desperate. Carlos tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle to be solved. "Every marriage has its secrets, doesn't it? The real question is whether you can live with the truth." Live with it. The phrase carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Elena thought of the men positioned around the cabin, the professional way they'd surrounded the building, the earpiece Miguel had been wearing. This wasn't a domestic dispute or a case of corporate fraud. This was something vast and organized, with resources that could make problems disappear permanently. "Our baby," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is any of it real?" For the first time, Carlos's mask slipped. Something flickered across his features. Regret? Genuine emotion? "The child is real, Elena. More real than you can possibly imagine." The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to the tension in her voice. Elena had read every pregnancy book, attended every appointment, felt every movement with wonder and anticipation. But now she remembered Carlos's insistence on specific vitamins, his interest in her family medical history, the way his mother had asked pointed questions about Elena's genetic background during their engagement. Project Genesis. Genetic markers confirm. The timing of the insertion must be precise. "You planned this," she breathed. "The pregnancy, you planned it." "We planned many things," Carlos said, his voice gentle in a way that made her skin crawl. "Your education, your career in forensic accounting, even your foster care placement after your grandmother died, every step designed to create the perfect operative." The cabin spun around her. 15 years old and grieving, she'd been placed with the Hendersons in Portland, a kind family who encouraged her mathematical abilities, who'd suggested forensic accounting as a career path. She'd thought it was luck, finally catching a break after years of loss and instability. The Hendersons were part of this? They played their role beautifully, as did your university professors, your first employers, even some of your FBI contacts. Carlos crouched beside her, bringing his face level with hers. "You've never made a choice that wasn't carefully orchestrated, Elena. Your entire life has been a cultivation project." Elena's world tilted sickeningly. Every achievement, every relationship, every moment of pride in her independence, all carefully manipulated by invisible hands. She thought of her forensic accounting certification, earned through years of night classes while working full-time, the breakthrough cases that had built her reputation, the satisfaction of bringing financial criminals to justice. None of it had been her triumph. She'd been a puppet dancing to strings she'd never even seen. "Why?" The word came out broken. Carlos reached toward her face and she flinched away. His hand dropped, but his expression remained eerily tender. "Because some destinies are too important to leave to chance." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, not the baby moving, but something deeper. The last fragile thread connecting her to the life she'd known finally snapped. Some destinies are too important to leave to chance. She stared at Carlos's face, searching for any trace of the man who'd held her hair back during morning sickness, who'd spent weekends assembling the crib in their carefully planned nursery. But looking at him now was like staring at a stranger wearing her husband's skin. Every tender moment, every whispered endearment, every promise about their future, all of it calculated manipulation by someone who'd been following a script written before she was born. "You don't understand yet," Carlos continued, his voice taking on the patient tone he might use with a child. "But you will. The organization your mother served, the one that's shaped your entire existence, it's bigger than governments, Elena, bigger than countries. We're talking about generational planning on a scale most people can't comprehend." Elena's hand pressed against her belly, feeling the steady rhythm of her child's heartbeat. Their child. But was it? Or was this pregnancy just another carefully orchestrated step in a plan she'd never consented to? The rain hammered against the cabin's windows with increasing fury, and Elena realized the storm had become her ally. The same weather that had trapped her here was also cutting off communication, limiting their options. They couldn't easily extract her in these conditions, couldn't simply make her disappear without risking exposure. "What happens to my baby?" she asked, surprised by the steel that had crept into her voice. Carlos's smile returned, but this time it carried something predatory. "Our baby will be everything we've worked toward. The culmination of decades of genetic selection and environmental conditioning. A perfect operative, trained from birth, with capabilities that—" "No." The word came out so quietly that Carlos almost missed it, but Elena felt it resonate through her entire body, a fundamental rejection that seemed to emanate from her very bones. "Elena?" "No." Louder now, fueled by a rage she'd never experienced before. "Whatever sick experiment you think you're running, whatever plan you've been following, my child will not be part of it." Carlos's expression darkened. "You don't have a choice in this. You never did." "Maybe not before." Elena struggled to her feet, ignoring the way her center of gravity had shifted with the pregnancy. "But I'm making one now." She thought of the vault below them, its impossible wealth, and the security footage that revealed truths she was still processing. A supposedly dead mother, moving through those corridors with practiced efficiency. The discussions of Project Genesis, the careful monitoring of Elena's development, the way every major decision in her life had been guided by invisible hands. They'd made one crucial mistake, though. In their obsession with control, they'd brought her to the one place where she might find answers. The biometric scanner that had recognized her handprint suggested a connection deeper than surveillance, a legacy she was only beginning to understand. "You're going to cooperate," Carlos said, rising to meet her gaze. "Because the alternative isn't just your death, Elena, it's your child's death. And despite everything you've learned tonight, I don't think you're prepared for that." The threat hung between them, like a physical thing. Elena felt her baby shift restlessly, as if sensing the tension in her body. 7 months of protection, of carefully monitoring every bite of food and avoiding the slightest risk. Now she faced the possibility that all her caution had been meaningless, that her child had been claimed before it was even born. But something else stirred inside her, something that felt almost foreign in its intensity. Maybe it was maternal instinct, or maybe it was simply the fury of someone who'd spent their entire life being manipulated. Either way, Elena found herself standing straighter, meeting Carlos's gaze with a steadiness that surprised them both. "You know what I think," she said, her voice cutting through the storm's howl. "I think you need me alive more than I need you. Otherwise, why the elaborate manipulation? Why not just take what you wanted by force?" Carlos's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Elena, I think whatever plan you're following requires my cooperation, my willing participation." She took a step toward him, ignoring every instinct that screamed at her to flee. Which means I have more power in this situation than you want me to realize. Outside, she could hear the muffled voices of the men Carlos had brought with him, their words lost in the storm, but their presence a constant threat. Miguel's shadow moved past the window, a reminder that even the family members she'd trusted might be compromised. But Elena was done being afraid, done being the perfect victim in someone else's story. Her old life, forensic accountant, dutiful wife, carefully controlled existence, was gone forever. But maybe that wasn't entirely a loss. Maybe it was finally time to discover who Elena Vasquez really was when nobody else was pulling the strings. The threshold had been crossed. There was no going back now. The silence stretched between them like a drawn blade. Carlos's eyes narrowed as he processed her defiance, calculating this new variable in what had clearly been a carefully scripted encounter. Elena could practically see the gears turning behind his expression, the realization that his perfectly manipulated puppet had just cut her own strings. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "No," Elena replied, her hands still pressed protectively over her belly. "The mistake was trusting any of you for as long as I did." Before Carlos could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Not Miguel's hesitant tap, but something urgent and commanding. Carlos's head snapped toward the sound, his composure finally cracking. "Carlos!" The voice belonged to Miguel, but it carried an edge Elena had never heard before. "We have a problem." The lock turned, and Miguel pushed through the door, rain streaming from his jacket. Behind him stood a woman Elena didn't recognize, elderly, perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything in a single glance. She wore practical outdoor gear that looked military in its precision, and when she moved, it was with the fluid economy of someone trained in violence. "Dr. Vasquez," the woman said, her accent carrying traces of Elena's grandmother's Eastern European inflections. "My name is Catherine Walsh. I worked with your mother." Elena's world tilted again. Worked with her mother. The security footage from the vault flashed through her memory. The woman she'd thought was dead, moving through those corridors with practiced familiarity. "That's impossible," Elena whispered. "My mother died when I was 5. "Your mother died 3 weeks ago," Catherine said quietly. "The same day you discovered the financial irregularities in the Mendoza accounts." Carlos stepped forward aggressively. "Catherine, you're out of bounds here. The situation is under control." "Is it?" Catherine's gaze never left Elena. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you've lost the initiative entirely." Elena felt as though she were watching a chess game played with pieces she didn't understand. Catherine's presence had shifted the dynamic completely. Carlos, who'd seemed so confident moments before, now radiated tension. Miguel looked between them like a man watching two predators circle each other. "I don't understand what's happening," Elena said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I know," Catherine replied, her expression softening slightly. "Your mother spent 27 years ensuring you wouldn't understand. It was the only way to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" "From them." Catherine nodded toward Carlos. "From the organization that thinks they own you." The baby kicked hard against Elena's ribs, as if responding to her elevated heart rate. She pressed both hands against her belly, trying to process this new information. Her mother, alive until 3 weeks ago, working with people who moved through underground vaults filled with impossible wealth, trying to protect Elena from forces she'd never even known existed. "Carmen Vasquez was one of our best operatives," Catherine continued. "But when she became pregnant with you, she began asking questions about the genetic testing, the behavioral conditioning, the long-term objectives of Project Genesis." Carlos's face had gone pale. "You're breaking protocol. The integration process requires—" "The integration process failed the moment you underestimated her," Catherine cut him off. "Just like your organization underestimated Carmen 28 years ago." Elena's mind raced, trying to connect fragments into a coherent picture, the vault that recognized her handprint, the security footage of her mother, the way Carlos had spoken about genetic selection and environmental conditioning, her entire life as a cultivation project. "My mother discovered something about the project," Elena said, the pieces finally clicking together, "something that made her run. She discovered that the children being produced weren't meant to be operatives." Catherine confirmed. "They were meant to be hosts." The word hit Elena like a physical blow. Hosts. She thought of the careful monitoring throughout her pregnancy, Carlos's insistence on specific vitamins, the way his mother had asked detailed questions about her family medical history. "What kind of hosts?" "For consciousness transfer," Catherine said grimly. "The organization's leadership is aging. They've developed technology that allows them to preserve and transfer their minds into younger, genetically compatible bodies, bodies that have been conditioned from birth to accept the process." Elena's legs gave out. She sank into the cabin's weathered chair, her hands trembling against her belly. Not just her life that had been manipulated. Her child's body was being prepared as a vessel for someone else's mind. "The timing of your pregnancy was critical," Catherine continued. "Neural pathways are most malleable during fetal development and the first few years of life. They needed the child born at precisely the right moment, with precisely the right genetic markers." Carlos stepped forward, his mask finally dropping completely. "Enough. Catherine, you're interfering with decades of planning." "Good," Catherine said simply. "Then, to Elena, your mother left you something in that vault. Something that can stop them permanently. But first, we need to get you away from here." Thunder crashed overhead as Elena realized her choice had just become infinitely more complex. Elena's world fractured into possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The cabin suddenly felt impossibly small, 3 different agendas pressing against her from all sides. Carlos represented everything she'd just learned to fear: manipulation, control, her child's body prepared as a vessel for horrors she couldn't fully comprehend. Catherine offered escape but demanded trust Elena wasn't sure she could give. And outside, Miguel's men waited with the patience of predators, their presence a constant reminder that choices made here might be her last. "You can't trust her," Carlos said, his voice tight with barely controlled desperation. "Catherine's been classified as rogue for over a decade. Whatever she's told you about your mother, about the organization, it's propaganda designed to turn you against everything we've built." But Catherine's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Built? You mean the systematic harvesting of children's minds? The decades of psychological conditioning designed to make them compliant hosts? Yes, Carlos, I can see why Elena would want to protect such noble work." Elena pressed her hands against her temples, feeling a headache building behind her eyes. Every word they spoke revealed new layers of nightmare, new depths to the conspiracy that had shaped her existence. The baby kicked restlessly, and she found herself wondering if even those movements were somehow part of their plan, if they'd calculated everything down to her child's activity patterns in the womb. "The vault," she said suddenly. "You both know what's in it. That's why you're really here." Something flickered across Carlos's features, surprised that she'd made the connection so quickly. Catherine nodded approvingly, like a teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. "Your forensic accounting background wasn't just career guidance," Catherine explained. "It was preparation. They needed you to have specific skills, yes, but your mother knew those same skills could be used against them. The evidence she compiled, financial records, communication logs, genetic research data, it's all there." "Evidence of what?" "Everything," Catherine said simply. 40 years of consciousness transfer research, the locations of their other facilities, the identities of every member in their command structure, enough to bring down the entire network. Carlos moved closer, his desperation becoming more apparent with each revelation. "You don't understand the scope of what you're threatening, Elena. We're not just some rogue organization. We have connections throughout governments, corporations, intelligence agencies. The technology we've developed could revolutionize human existence." "By stealing children's bodies," Elena shot back, surprised by the venom in her own voice, by preserving the minds of our greatest leaders. Imagine Einstein living for centuries, his genius preserved. Imagine my child never getting to live their own life, Elena interrupted. Imagine their consciousness erased to make room for some ancient psychopath who thinks immortality is their right. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Elena found herself speaking directly to that movement. "I won't let them," she whispered. "I promise you, I won't let them." Catherine checked her watch, tension creeping into her expression. "We need to move. My extraction team can be here in 20 minutes, but only if we leave now. Once Carlos's backup arrives..." "She's not going anywhere," Carlos said firmly. "Miguel has orders to prevent any unauthorized departures." As if summoned by his name, Miguel appeared in the doorway again. But, instead of the submissive nephew Elena remembered, his posture was alert, professional. His hand rested casually near his jacket, in a position that suggested concealed weapons. "Perimeter secure," he reported to Carlos. "But Catherine's people are moving through the tree line. We have maybe 15 minutes before this becomes a shooting war." Elena's blood chilled. A shooting war. With her caught in the middle, 7 months pregnant and increasingly certain that everyone in this cabin would sacrifice her life to achieve their objectives. "There's another option," she said quietly, the words forming as she spoke them. "I go back to the vault alone." Both Carlos and Catherine turned to stare at her. "The biometric scanner recognized me," Elena continued, standing slowly. "Whatever my mother left there, she left it for me specifically. Not for either of your organizations, for me." "Elena, that's suicide," Catherine warned. "If you access those files without proper protection..." "If I access them with either of you, I become a pawn in someone else's game again," Elena countered. "At least this way, I'm making my own choice." Carlos stepped forward. "The vault has security measures beyond what you encountered. Defensive systems that..." "That what? That kill me?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "You've just spent the evening explaining how my entire existence has been manipulated by people who want to hollow out my child's mind. Death is starting to look like a reasonable alternative." Lightning illuminated the cabin's windows, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the building's foundations. The storm was intensifying, which meant any rescue or extraction would become increasingly dangerous. Time was running out for all of them. Elena moved toward her jacket hanging by the door. "I'm going down there, alone." Thunder crashed again as she stepped into the night, leaving 3 people who claimed to know her future staring after her in stunned silence. The storm struck Elena like a living thing the moment she stepped outside. Rain lashed against her face with surprising force, and wind howled through the towering pines that surrounded the clearing. Each step toward the main cabin became a battle against elements that seemed determined to drive her back to the false safety of human manipulation. But Elena pressed forward, her hands instinctively protecting her belly as she navigated the treacherous path. Behind her, she could hear voices raised in urgent argument. Carlos and Catherine probably debating whether to follow her immediately or let her trigger whatever defenses awaited. Miguel's men moved like shadows between the trees, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness in coordinated patterns that spoke of military training. The main cabin loomed before her, its moss-covered logs glistening in the rain. Elena fumbled for the hidden lever she'd discovered earlier, her fingers numb with cold and adrenaline. The entrance to the vault seemed even more ominous now, a mouth leading into secrets that had cost her mother 27 years of hidden life. As she descended the metal stairs, Elena realized she was crossing more than a physical threshold. Everything above, her old identity, her careful forensic accountant's life, even her pregnancy as she'd understood it, belonged to other people's plans. Down here, in whatever sanctuary her mother had prepared, she might finally discover who Elena Vasquez was supposed to be. The biometric scanner glowed to life as she approached, its red light painting the reinforced walls like dried blood. Elena pressed her palm against the surface, feeling the familiar tingle as it read patterns she'd never known she carried. But this time she noticed something else, a slight vibration, as if the scanner was accessing systems beyond simple identification. The massive door swung open with mechanical precision, revealing the vault in all its impossible wealth. Mountains of bearer bonds, gold bars stacked like building blocks, and the wall of monitors that had shown her mother's secret life. But now Elena saw details she'd missed in her earlier panic. Security cameras tracked her movement with predatory attention. Motion sensors created an invisible web throughout the space, and in the corner, barely visible behind the computer terminals, stood something that made her blood freeze. A medical chair, sleek, modern, with restraint systems and monitoring equipment that belonged in an operating theater. Cables ran from its base to servers that hummed with barely contained power, and nearby tables held instruments she couldn't identify but instinctively feared. This wasn't just a vault, it was a laboratory. Elena approached the main computer terminal with growing dread, her forensic training automatically cataloging what she observed. The medical equipment was too sophisticated for simple monitoring. The restraint systems were designed for someone who might struggle, and the positioning of everything suggested procedures that would take hours to complete. The screens flickered to life as she drew near, responding to her presence with the same eerie recognition as the biometric scanner. But instead of security footage, she found herself looking at medical files, brain scans, genetic sequences, and her own photograph, taken recently enough that her pregnancy was visible. Subject, 47 alpha. Neural compatibility, 98.7%. Conditioning phase complete. Transfer window, 72 hours post-delivery. Elena's legs gave out and she collapsed into a chair that had been positioned perfectly for reviewing the monitors. 72 hours after her baby was born, they planned to use this equipment. Not on her child, on her. She was the host. Her child was simply the catalyst, the biological trigger that would prepare her neural pathways for invasion. The pregnancy wasn't about creating the next generation of operatives. It was about preparing Elena's brain to accept another consciousness. Someone ancient and powerful wanted to steal her body, and they'd spent 29 years conditioning her for the transfer. But as the full horror of their plan settled over her, Elena noticed something else in the files. Annotations in a different color, additions made recently. Her mother's work, she realized. Carmen Vasquez had discovered the truth and used her access to sabotage the process. Neural pathway disruption protocols, counter-conditioning techniques, and buried deep in the medical data, something labeled termination sequence. Elena's hands trembled as she accessed that final file. The screen filled with technical specifications she barely understood, but the conclusion was clear enough. Her mother had found a way to destroy the consciousness transfer technology permanently. Not just for Elena, but for every facility in their network. The equipment, the research, the decades of development, all of it could be eliminated with a single command sequence. But executing the termination protocol would require her to remain in the vault, while electromagnetic pulses fried every piece of electronic equipment within a 50-mile radius, including the medical monitors that were now tracking her baby's heartbeat. Above her, she could hear footsteps on the metal stairs. Carlos, Catherine, or both, coming to claim what they thought belonged to them. The greatest fear of Elena's life wasn't choosing between different forms of captivity. It was choosing between saving her child and saving every other child who would suffer the same fate. The cursor blinked beside the execution command, waiting for her decision. Elena's finger hovered over the execution command as the footsteps above grew closer. The weight of choice pressed against her chest like a physical thing, making each breath a struggle. Save her child or save countless others. The mathematics of sacrifice that her forensic training had taught her to calculate in financial terms now applied to human lives, including her own. The cursor blinked with mechanical patience, indifferent to the magnitude of what it represented. One keystroke would send electromagnetic pulses through the entire network, frying decades of research and destroying the technology that had turned children into commodities. But those same pulses would surge through every piece of electronic equipment in the vault, including the medical monitors that had begun tracking her baby's vital signs the moment she'd entered. "Elena!" Carlos's voice echoed down the stairwell, closer now. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, remember that your child needs you alive." But did her child need her alive, or did the organization? Elena stared at the medical files spread across the monitors, at the detailed brain scans that showed neural pathways mapped with surgical precision. Subject 47 Alpha. They'd been studying her for years, preparing her mind for invasion, and pregnancy was simply the final phase of conditioning. The baby kicked against her ribs, a movement that once would have brought joy but now felt like a countdown timer. 72 hours after delivery. That's how long she had before they strapped her into the medical chair and erased everything she'd ever been. A new set of footsteps joined Carlos on the stairs, lighter, more cautious. Catherine's voice drifted down. "Elena, if you trigger that sequence without proper evacuation protocols, you'll kill yourself and the baby." Both of them knew what she'd found. Both of them needed her to make a different choice. Carlos to preserve his organization's investment, Catherine to capture their research intact. Neither cared that Elena Vasquez, the woman who'd spent her career following financial trails and believed in the power of truth, was about to disappear forever. Elena's hands shook as she scrolled through her mother's annotations, searching desperately for another option. Carmen Vasquez had spent 27 years infiltrating the organization, documenting their crimes, preparing this moment of reckoning. But even her mother hadn't found a way to destroy the network without sacrificing Elena in the process. The computer chimed softly, and a new window appeared on the screen. Security footage from the cabin above, showing Miguel's men taking positions around the clearing. Motion sensors detected Catherine's extraction team moving through the forest, weapons ready. In 12 minutes, the two forces would meet, and the vault would become either a tomb or a prize. Elena pressed both hands against her belly, feeling her child's restless movements. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I can't give you the life you deserve." But as her finger moved toward the execution command, a final annotation caught her eye. Hidden in the medical data, written in her mother's careful handwriting, "Emergency Extraction Protocol. Genetic override, possible with dual authorization." Elena's heart hammered as she opened the file. Dual authorization, 2 subjects with compatible genetic markers, could trigger a modified termination sequence that would destroy the network while preserving life support systems in the vault. Elena could execute the protocol, but she needed someone else with the right DNA signature to confirm it. Someone like Carlos, whose family had been part of the organization for generations. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Elena minimized the windows and turned as Carlos appeared in the vault entrance, his face pale with barely controlled panic. Behind him, Catherine moved with predator grace, her hand resting on a concealed weapon. "Step away from the terminal," Carlos said, his voice tight. "You don't understand the consequences." "I understand that you want to hollow out my mind," Elena replied, standing slowly. "I understand that my child was conceived as a biological trigger to make me compliant for consciousness transfer." Catherine's eyes widened slightly. "You found the medical files, all of them." Elena met Carlos's gaze steadily, "Including my mother's termination protocol." Carlos went white. "Elena, if you trigger that sequence, I'll die taking your entire network with me," she finished, "unless you help me find another way." But even as she spoke, Elena realized the fatal flaw in her desperate hope. The dual authorization protocol required both subjects to consent freely. Carlos would never volunteer to destroy everything his organization had built, and Catherine represented a rival faction that wanted to capture the technology intact. The baby kicked again, weaker this time, and Elena felt something shift inside her. A cramp that started low in her back and wrapped around her belly with increasing intensity. Stress, exhaustion, and terror were taking their toll. Her body was beginning to shut down. "Elena?" Catherine stepped forward, concern replacing calculation in her expression. "You're bleeding," Elena looked down to see dark spots spreading across the concrete floor. The choice was being taken from her, one drop at a time. Elena stared at the blood pooling beneath her feet, and suddenly everything crystallized with brutal clarity. The cramping, the baby's weakened movements, the way her vision blurred at the edges, her body was failing, pushed beyond its limits by months of carefully orchestrated stress. But it wasn't random. It wasn't even truly caused by the terror of this moment. "The conditioning," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of machinery. "It wasn't just psychological." Carlos took a step forward, his face shifting from panic to something that looked almost like relief. "Elena, you need medical attention." "The pregnancy symptoms," she continued, ignoring him as pieces fell into place with forensic precision. "The fainting spells, the blood pressure fluctuations. You've been medicating me." Catherine's hand moved away from her weapon. "What are you talking about?" Elena's mind raced through months of memories with new understanding. The prenatal vitamins Carlos had so thoughtfully provided, the specialized supplements his family's doctor had prescribed, the way her symptoms had intensified whenever she'd skipped doses, driving her back to compliance through fear for her baby's health. "Neural pathway conditioning through biochemical manipulation," she said, reading directly from the medical files still glowing on the screens. "Hormonal triggers that prepare the brain for consciousness transfer." The pregnancy wasn't just psychological conditioning, it was biological warfare. The vault suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as Elena realized the true scope of their planning. Every dizzy spell had been calculated, every moment of weakness had served their purpose. They'd been chemically rewriting her brain for months, using her maternal instincts to ensure compliance. "How long?" she demanded, turning to face Carlos. "How long have you been poisoning me?" Carlos's silence was answer enough, but Catherine stepped forward, her expression grim. "Since the moment the pregnancy was confirmed, maybe earlier." "You knew," Elena breathed. "We suspected. Our intelligence suggested biochemical conditioning, but we needed proof." Catherine gestured toward the monitors. "This confirms it. They've been preparing your neural pathways since conception, using the pregnancy hormones as a delivery system." The baby's movements had grown even weaker, and Elena felt another cramp building. But now she understood what was happening. The withdrawal from their carefully designed chemical cocktail was triggering premature labor. Her body, deprived of the substances it had been conditioned to need, was shutting down. "The medical chair," she said, looking at the equipment in the corner with new horror. "It's not just for the consciousness transfer, it's life support. You're going to induce labor, then keep me alive just long enough for the procedure." "Elena," Carlos's voice carried a note of genuine pleading. "You can't fight this anymore. Your system is too dependent on the conditioning protocols. Without medical intervention, I die," she finished, "taking your perfect host with me." But even as she spoke, Elena was accessing more files, her fingers flying across the keyboard despite the cramping that made her double over. The emergency extraction protocol her mother had designed, it wasn't just about destroying the network, it was about survival. Carmen Vasquez had anticipated this moment, the biochemical conditioning, the induced dependency, the way they would use Elena's own body as a weapon against her, and she had prepared a countermeasure. "Cellular regeneration matrix," Elena read from the screen, hope blooming despite her fear. "Biochemical neutralization sequence, medical stabilization during electromagnetic termination." The protocol wasn't just designed to destroy their technology, it was designed to save Elena and her child while doing it. But it required something her mother couldn't have predicted: real-time biometric monitoring from both parent and child during execution. Elena looked at the medical chair she'd feared moments before. It wasn't just their equipment, it was her lifeline, the only way to monitor her baby's vital signs while triggering the termination sequence. She would have to trust the same technology they'd designed to enslave her and pray her mother's sabotage was thorough enough to transform it into salvation. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Elena knew she was out of time for careful consideration. The withdrawal was accelerating. In minutes, she would be too weak to execute any plan. "Catherine," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Your extraction team, do they have medical training?" "Some." "Why?" Elena met her gaze directly. "Because I'm going to need someone to monitor the medical equipment while I destroy everything else." She turned to Carlos, seeing the horrified understanding dawn in his eyes. "And you're going to help me do it?" "Elena, no." "Yes," she said firmly, moving toward the medical chair. "Because if you don't, we all die here tonight. Your organization, Catherine's intelligence operation, and everyone in a 50-mile radius when I trigger the uncontrolled termination sequence." The baby kicked once more, weak but persistent, and Elena placed both hands on her belly. "But if you help me execute my mother's protocol exactly as she designed it, maybe, just maybe, we all get to live with the consequences of our choices." Thunder crashed overhead as Elena began connecting monitoring cables to her body, preparing to trust her life to the mercy of machines. The monitoring cables felt cold against Elena's skin as she methodically attached each sensor, her forensic accountant's precision serving her even now. The medical chair's displays flickered to life, showing readouts she'd learned to interpret during months of careful observation: heart rate, blood oxygen, neural activity patterns that revealed the depth of their biochemical manipulation. "The baby's heart rate is dropping," Catherine observed, reading the monitors over Elena's shoulder. She'd moved closer, her intelligence operative training recognizing the critical nature of their situation. "Whatever they've been giving you, withdrawal is accelerating." Elena's hands trembled as she accessed her mother's protocol on the main terminal. The cellular regeneration matrix required precise timing. Too early, and the electromagnetic pulse would overwhelm her weakened system. Too late, and the biochemical withdrawal would trigger complete organ failure. "Carlos," she said without looking at him, "I need your genetic authorization code." "I can't." "Look at the monitors." Elena's voice cut through his protest. "Look at what your family's conditioning is doing to my child." The displays showed a fetal heart rate that dipped with each passing minute, neural patterns fragmenting as the withdrawal stripped away months of artificial stability. The baby was dying along with her, poisoned by the same chemicals that had prepared Elena for violation. Carlos stepped closer to the terminal, his face ashen. "If I authorize this, it destroys everything. Generations of research, resources my family died protecting." "Resources built on stolen children," Elena replied, "built on women like me, conditioned and bred for use." Another contraction seized her, stronger than before, and the monitors erupted in alarms. Blood pressure spiking, neural activity fluctuating wildly as her brain struggled to function without its chemical crutches. She had minutes, perhaps less, before the withdrawal became irreversible. "Elena." Catherine's voice held unexpected gentleness. "My extraction team has a medic. If you can stabilize long enough for extraction..." "To what? Another facility? Another organization that wants to study me?" Elena shook her head, accessing the termination sequence despite the pain that made her vision blur. "This ends here, tonight, with my mother's plan." But, even as she spoke, Elena realized she'd miscalculated something crucial. The protocol required continuous monitoring throughout the electromagnetic cascade. Someone would need to remain in the vault, adjusting parameters as the pulse waves destroyed system after system. Her mother's plan assumed Elena would survive long enough to complete the sequence manually. The baby's movements had become barely perceptible, weak flutters that felt more like muscle spasms than healthy activity. The cellular regeneration matrix could counteract the biochemical withdrawal, but only if Elena could maintain consciousness through the entire procedure. "There's another way," Carlos said suddenly, his voice tight with an emotion Elena couldn't identify. "The medical chair has autonomous monitoring protocols. If we activate life support before triggering the termination sequence, you'd save me to preserve your research," Elena finished. "No." Carlos moved to a secondary terminal, his fingers flying over controls Elena hadn't noticed before. I'd save you because 29 years ago, your mother saved my sister. Elena's hands stilled on the keyboard. What? Carmen Vasquez pulled my sister out of the conditioning program when she was 7 years old, falsified medical records, made it look like the girl died in an accident. Carlos's voice carried decades of buried guilt. I've known who you were since our first date. I've known what they planned to do to you, and I've spent 2 years trying to find the courage my sister never got. The monitors showed Elena's vital signs deteriorating rapidly, but she forced herself to focus on Carlos's words. Your sister? Dr. Sarah Chen, the one who designed your prenatal vitamins. Carlos met her gaze directly, the one who's been reducing the conditioning agents for months, preparing you for this moment. Elena's world tilted. The doctor she'd trusted, the woman who'd monitored her pregnancy with such careful attention, she'd been sabotaging the conditioning from within, working with Elena's mother to prepare for tonight. The life support protocols, Catherine said, understanding dawning in her voice. They're not designed to keep you alive for consciousness transfer. They're designed to sustain you through biochemical rehabilitation. Elena looked at the medical chair with new eyes, not an instrument of torture, but a cocoon of healing. Her mother's final gift, hidden within the very technology meant to destroy her. How long? She asked Carlos. 48 hours of complete life support while the cellular regeneration matrix repairs the neurological damage. Then you're free. Carlos entered his authorization code, the system chiming acceptance. But Elena, once we trigger this, there's no going back. Every facility, every research archive, every backup system in their network gets destroyed. Elena's finger hovered over the final execution command as the baby kicked once more, stronger than before, as if responding to the possibility of real freedom. Then let's give them hell, she whispered, and pressed the key that would transform her prison into her salvation. The vault erupted in light as electromagnetic pulses began cascading through the network, carrying her mother's vengeance to every corner of their empire. The electromagnetic cascade filled the vault with an otherworldly blue-white glow as system after system throughout the network began dying. Elena watched the termination sequence spread across the monitors like wildfire. Research facilities in 7 countries going dark, data centers wiping themselves clean, backup servers melting into slag as her mother's virus consumed everything in its path. But the light was also inside her now, flowing through the life support systems as the cellular regeneration matrix began its work. The medical chair hummed with purpose, flooding her bloodstream with neutralizing agents that stripped away months of biochemical conditioning. Every heartbeat carried the promise of freedom, even as it carried the agony of withdrawal. Neural pathways stabilizing, Carlos called over the increasing alarm sounds. He worked frantically at the monitoring station, adjusting parameters as electromagnetic pulses threatened to overload the vault's own systems. The regeneration matrix is holding. Elena gripped the chair's armrests as another wave of cellular reconstruction swept through her body. She could feel the artificial dependencies burning away, the chemical chains that had bound her thoughts dissolving under her mother's careful programming. But the process felt like being torn apart and rebuilt molecule by molecule. On the monitors, facility after facility winked out of existence. The construction empire Miguel's family had built as a front, every computer, every financial record, every piece of evidence that could tie them to the cartel money, erasing itself in cascading failure. The organization that had stolen her life was hemorrhaging decades of work with each passing second. Elena, Catherine's voice seemed to come from very far away. Your baby's heart rate is strengthening. Through the haze of reconstruction, Elena felt it too. The weak, irregular movements becoming more purposeful, more alive. The conditioning hadn't just poisoned her, it had been slowly poisoning her child, preparing even an unborn consciousness for eventual manipulation. Now, as the toxins cleared from her system, she felt her baby responding with increasing vigor. The vault shook as explosions echoed from somewhere above. Miguel's men had arrived, drawn by the electromagnetic emissions that were impossible to hide. Catherine spoke rapidly into her radio, coordinating with her extraction team as gunfire erupted in the forest beyond the cabin. "How much longer?" Catherine demanded, checking her weapon. 18 hours minimum for basic stabilization, Carlos replied, his attention fixed on the medical readouts. The cellular regeneration can't be rushed without risking permanent neural damage. "We don't have 18 hours. Catherine moved toward the vault entrance. "My team can hold them for maybe 90 minutes before Miguel brings in heavier support." Elena forced words through the reconstruction haze. "Then we hold here." "Elena, you can't—" "The vault." She struggled to focus on Catherine's face, designed to survive electromagnetic warfare. "They can't breach the door while the pulse generators are active." Catherine's expression shifted as she understood. The same electromagnetic cascade destroying the network was also creating an impenetrable barrier around them. The vault had become a fortress powered by its own destruction sequence, but it was a fortress with a time limit. Once the termination protocol completed, they would be vulnerable again. Carlos suddenly straightened at his console. "Elena, look at this." Despite the agony coursing through her body, Elena turned her head toward the monitors. The termination sequence had reached something unexpected, hidden archives buried so deep in the network that even her mother hadn't known they existed. Genetic profiles, conditioning protocols, and research data spanning not years but decades. "They've been doing this since the 1940s, Carlos whispered. "Not just our organization. Dozens of them worldwide, trading subjects, sharing research, breeding families specifically for neural compatibility." Elena watched her own genetic profile scroll past, alongside dozens of others. Children born into elaborate lies, their entire lives orchestrated to produce perfect candidates for consciousness transfer. She saw Carlos's sister listed among the recovered assets, children who had been rescued or had escaped, their freedom bought with blood and sacrifice. "My mother," Elena managed. "How many others did she save?" 43 confirmed extractions over 27 years, Carlos read from the files. Carmen Vasquez didn't just infiltrate the organization. She spent 3 decades systematically dismantling their breeding programs. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Her mother hadn't just been gathering intelligence. She had been conducting a secret war, saving children one by one while building toward this moment of total destruction. Every year of separation, every lie about her death, had been in service of protecting dozens of families from the fate Elena now faced. Thunder crashed overhead, but it wasn't from the storm. The electromagnetic pulses were destabilizing the entire mountain's electrical grid, sending power surges through every system for miles. Elena realized with crystal clarity that they hadn't just declared war on a single organization, they had struck at the heart of a conspiracy that spanned continents. "They'll come for us," she said, feeling strength returning to her voice as the regeneration matrix continued its work. "All of them. Every remaining facility, every backup organization. They can't let this intelligence survive." Catherine nodded grimly. "Which means we need to be ready for a siege, not just tonight, but for weeks." Elena looked at the monitors showing the systematic destruction of everything that had once threatened her child's future. The road back to her old life was gone, burned away in electromagnetic fire. But ahead lay something her mother had paid everything to make possible, a chance to build something new from the ashes of their lies. "Then we'd better start planning," Elena said, and felt her baby kick with newfound strength. The electromagnetic storm raging above ground was nothing compared to the chaos erupting in Elena's mind as the true scope of their situation crystallized. The monitors showed incoming tactical teams from 3 directions, not just Miguel's men, but black SUVs bearing government plates and unmarked helicopters that suggested international involvement. The termination sequence had triggered every alarm in a conspiracy that reached far beyond one family's criminal empire. "They're coordinating," Catherine observed, her voice tight as she monitored radio intercepts. "Military-grade equipment, synchronized approach patterns." Elena, we didn't just poke a hornet's nest, we declared war on the entire hive. Elena felt the regeneration matrix surge through her bloodstream, burning away another layer of biochemical conditioning. With each wave of cellular reconstruction came fragments of suppressed memory, moments from her childhood when strangers had visited, when her foster families had asked specific questions, when medical checkups had involved tests no normal child should need. Her entire life had been a carefully maintained experiment, and now she was remembering the cage bars. "Carlos," she said, her voice growing stronger as the artificial dependencies dissolved. "The genetic profiles in those archives show me the breeding charts." His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up data that made Elena's stomach clench, even through the medical chair's stabilizing influence. Generation after generation of planned matches, children moved like chess pieces across continents to produce optimal genetic combinations. The conspiracy hadn't just stolen individual lives, it had manipulated bloodlines for nearly a century. "Look at this," Carlos whispered, highlighting a section that made Elena's breath catch. "Your child's genetic profile, it's not just random compatibility. The combination of your maternal line with Miguel's paternal genetics creates something they've been trying to achieve for decades." Elena stared at the projections, showing enhanced neural plasticity, increased resistance to conventional conditioning, and cognitive capabilities that bordered on the impossible. They hadn't just wanted to use her child as a host, they had engineered her pregnancy to create the perfect vessel for consciousness transfer. Every moment of her relationship with Miguel had been orchestrated to produce this specific outcome. The baby moved inside her, and Elena felt something that made her gasp. Not just the strengthening movements of healthy development, but something else, a strange resonance, as if the child was responding to the electromagnetic cascade destroying the network above them. The genetic modifications they had planned were manifesting naturally, triggered by the very forces meant to free them. "Neural activity is spiking," Carlos called out, alarm creeping into his voice. "Both maternal and fetal readings are off the charts." Elena looked at the monitors showing her brain patterns and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the life support systems. The regeneration matrix wasn't just neutralizing the conditioning, it was awakening something that had always been there, buried beneath chemical suppression and artificial limitations. Her mother's genetics, combined with whatever enhancements they had built into Miguel's bloodline, were creating abilities that neither parent possessed alone. This is why they needed generational planning, she realized aloud. Not just to create a compatible host, but to develop something genuinely superhuman. The vault shuddered as the first explosion struck the cabin above. Through the security feeds, Elena watched tactical teams positioning shaped charges, while government agents established a perimeter that stretched for miles. They weren't planning a rescue operation, they were preparing for total containment, willing to level the entire mountain if necessary to prevent their secrets from spreading further. Catherine checked her weapons, her expression grim. "My extraction team is pinned down 3 miles out. We're on our own until the electromagnetic interference clears." "Then we use what we have," Elena said, accessing her mother's files with a clarity of thought that surprised her. The regeneration process had burned away more than just chemical dependencies. It had removed cognitive limitations she hadn't known existed. Her mind was operating with a precision that made her forensic accounting skills seem primitive by comparison. The archives contained more than just breeding records and research data. Hidden within the termination sequence were protocols her mother had spent years developing, contingency plans for exactly this situation. Elena found detailed schematics of the vault's defensive systems, emergency procedures for extending the electromagnetic barrier, and most importantly, a communication array that could broadcast their evidence globally while bypassing every security system on the planet. "She knew," Elena breathed, understanding flooding through her as she accessed file after file of carefully prepared countermeasures. "My mother knew they would all come at once. She designed this entire scenario to force them into the open." Another massive explosion rocked the mountain, and Elena felt her baby respond with movements that seemed almost purposeful, as if the child understood that its very existence was the catalyst for this war. The genetic modifications were accelerating, triggered by stress hormones and electromagnetic exposure that would have been impossible to replicate in any laboratory. Elena looked at the monitors showing dozens of armed teams converging on their position and felt something she hadn't experienced since discovering Miguel's betrayal: anticipation. Her mother had prepared for this moment. Every sacrifice, every year of separation, every carefully planted piece of sabotage had been building toward tonight. The final test wasn't about survival, it was about transformation. "Catherine," Elena said, her voice carrying new authority as the regeneration matrix completed another phase of reconstruction. "Start uploading everything to the global broadcast array. It's time the world learned what they've been hiding." The global broadcast array hummed to life with a resonance that Elena felt in her bones, its electromagnetic pulse joining the symphony of destruction already cascading through the network above. But as Catherine's fingers flew across the upload controls, the Vault's defensive systems suddenly screamed warnings that chilled Elena's enhanced blood. "They're not trying to breach the door," Carlos shouted over the alarms, his face pale as he monitored incoming signals. "Elena, they're jamming the broadcast. Every satellite, every communication relay within 500 miles just went dark." Elena forced herself upright in the medical chair despite the regeneration matrix still coursing through her system. The enhanced cognitive abilities flooding her consciousness brought terrible clarity. They had walked into her mother's trap, but so had she. The conspiracy had been planning for this moment too, waiting for Carmen Vasquez's daughter to finally reveal herself and all her mother's hidden assets. The electromagnetic barrier, Elena realized with growing horror. It's not just protecting us, it's marking our exact location for orbital targeting. Through the security feeds, she watched the tactical teams suddenly retreating from the cabin above, their movements urgent and coordinated. Government vehicles pulled back beyond the tree line, while unmarked aircraft evacuated the immediate area. They weren't preparing for a siege anymore. They were clearing the blast radius. "Kinetic bombardment satellite," Catherine whispered, reading military communications her equipment had intercepted. "Impact in 12 minutes." Elena's baby kicked violently, and she felt the genetic modifications surge through both their systems in response to mortal terror. The enhanced neural pathways her mother's bloodline carried were awakening with desperate intensity, flooding her consciousness with capabilities she had never imagined possible. But superhuman cognition was useless against a tungsten rod dropped from orbit at 11 times the speed of sound. "There has to be something," Elena said, her enhanced mind racing through her mother's files with impossible speed. Carmen spent 27 years preparing for this. She wouldn't have built a tomb. Carlos suddenly straightened at his console, his expression shifting from despair to amazement. "Elena, look at the vault schematics, really look at them." Elena directed her enhanced perception toward the architectural plans, and her breath caught. Hidden beneath the standard bunker design was something far more sophisticated, a complete survival module capable of independent operation for months. But more than that, the entire vault was designed to move. "It's not a bunker," she breathed. "It's an escape pod." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her mother hadn't just built a fortress, she had constructed an underground vessel capable of boring through solid rock, powered by the same electromagnetic systems now protecting them from conventional assault. The vault could burrow deep into the mountain's geological structure, beyond the reach of any surface weapon. "Activation requires dual biometric confirmation," Carlos read from the emergency protocols. "Elena's handprint and mine." The voice came from the vault's entrance as the massive door cycled open with a pneumatic hiss. Elena's enhanced vision focused on the figure stepping through the electromagnetic barrier, and her world tilted on its axis. Miguel stood in the doorway, but his face carried none of the cold calculation she had seen during their last confrontation. Instead, she saw something that made her genetic modification surge with conflicting responses. Genuine terror. 10 minutes until impact, he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Elena, I know what I am. I know what they made me. But I also know that our child doesn't deserve to die for their sins. Catherine's weapon tracked toward Miguel, but Elena found herself speaking before conscious thought could intervene. How did you get through the barrier? The same genetic markers that made me their perfect breeding asset also make me compatible with your mother's security systems. Miguel's hands were empty, his posture non-threatening despite the tactical gear he wore. Carmen planned for this too, Elena. She knew that eventually I might be the only one who could save you. Elena's enhanced perception read truth in his biometric signatures, elevated stress consistent with genuine fear rather than deception. The regeneration matrix had burned away her ability to be fooled by surface emotions, and beneath Miguel's exhaustion, she sensed something that shattered her assumptions about their entire relationship. You've been fighting them, she realized, not just tonight, for months. Since the moment I learned what they wanted from our child. Miguel moved toward the emergency controls with desperate urgency. Elena, I can trigger the escape sequence, but once we're underground, there's no coming back to the surface, ever. The vault is designed for deep Earth survival, beyond the reach of any technology they possess. Elena felt her baby respond to Miguel's proximity with movements that seemed almost eager. The genetic modifications weren't just enhancing her abilities, they were creating familial bonds that transcended the conspiracy's manipulations. Their child recognized its father, despite everything that had torn them apart. Catherine, Elena said, her voice carrying new authority. Send the global broadcast now before the satellite strike. Even if they destroy the transmission array, some of it might get through. As the upload began and the escape pod powered to life, Elena realized her mother's final gift wasn't just survival, it was the chance to build something entirely new from the ashes of their manufactured lives. The countdown reached 8 minutes, and Elena placed her hand on the biometric scanner beside Miguel's. The scanner flashed green, and the vault transformed around them. What Elena had mistaken for static walls began to retract, revealing a vessel that belonged in science fiction rather than a Depression-era logging camp. Emergency lighting cast everything in crimson as the escape pod systems roared to life with mechanical precision that spoke of decades of hidden preparation. 6 minutes until impact, Carlos announced, his voice tight with controlled panic as he transferred the global broadcast to emergency servers. Upload is at 30%. Elena felt the regeneration matrix complete its final cycle, flooding her system with clarity so sharp it was almost painful. Her enhanced perception could track every detail simultaneously, Miguel's biometrics confirming genuine terror, Catherine's tactical assessment of their impossible situation, the baby's increasingly urgent movements as genetic modifications accelerated in response to crisis. But beneath the chaos, she sensed something else. A choice her mother had engineered with mathematical precision. The escape sequence, Elena said, her enhanced cognition processing the schematics faster than humanly possible. It's not just about survival, look at the power requirements. Miguel's face went pale as he followed her reasoning. The electromagnetic drill will draw every amp from the broadcast array. We can't do both. Elena stared at the control interface, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. Her mother's final gift came with the cruelest possible choice. They could save themselves by fleeing deep into the Earth's crust, or they could transmit the evidence that would expose the conspiracy worldwide. But not both. The broadcast reached 50% completion as another countdown began. The escape pod's launch sequence that would take them beyond the reach of orbital weapons, but sever their connection to the surface world forever. Elena watched the numbers climbing and falling in opposite directions, her enhanced mind calculating the exact moment when choice would be stolen from them entirely. 70%, Catherine reported, sweat beading her forehead despite the vault's cool air. But Elena, we have maybe 3 minutes before the tunnel sequence has to start. or we'll still be in the blast radius when that rod hits." Elena's baby kicked with desperate intensity, and she felt the genetic modifications surge through both their systems in a way that bordered on telepathic communication. The child wasn't just responding to stress, it was trying to tell her something. The enhanced neural pathways they had engineered weren't just for consciousness transfer, they were for connection. "The archives," Elena breathed, her enhanced perception suddenly seeing patterns that had been invisible moments before. "My mother didn't just gather evidence about our conspiracy, she mapped all of them. Every breeding program, every hidden facility, every backup organization worldwide." Carlos's eyes widened as he understood. The broadcast isn't just exposing what they did to us, it's revealing the location of every child still trapped in their programs. "2 minutes until we have to choose," Miguel said, his hand hovering over the escape controls. "Elena, I won't make this decision for you. Not again." Elena looked at the monitors showing the upload progress, 85% and climbing, while the escape sequence countdown reached critical parameters. Her enhanced mind could see exactly how the math worked. They could guarantee their own survival and lose the chance to save dozens of other families, or they could ensure the evidence reached the world and die in the attempt. But as her baby moved inside her with what felt like purposeful urgency, Elena suddenly understood the third option her mother had hidden in plain sight. "Catherine," she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Transfer the upload to me." "What?" Catherine's fingers paused over the controls. "The genetic modifications aren't just enhancing my cognition, they're creating bandwidth. My neural pathways can carry the data stream directly." Elena felt the truth of it resonating through every enhanced cell in her body. "I can be the broadcast array." Miguel grabbed her arm, his face stricken. "Elena, that much electromagnetic energy will kill you. The baby will survive," Elena finished, her enhanced perception reading the biological data with crystalline clarity. "The genetic modifications made sure of that. Our child can withstand the energy levels that would destroy an unmodified human." She placed her hand over Miguel's on the biometric scanner, feeling their combined genetic signatures unlock the vault's deepest protocols. "My mother didn't just prepare for our escape, Miguel. She prepared for our transformation." 90% upload completion, Carlos called out, his voice breaking with understanding. 1 minute until bombardment." Elena closed her eyes and felt the data stream flowing into her consciousness like liquid fire. 43 children's locations burned into her enhanced memory, alongside evidence that would topple governments and destroy conspiracies on 6 continents. The electromagnetic energy coursing through her nervous system pushed her modifications beyond their design parameters, but her baby responded with movements that felt like encouragement rather than distress. "Launch sequence initiating," Miguel whispered, tears streaming down his face as he activated the escape pod. "Elena, I'm sorry. For everything." Elena smiled as the tunnel bore opened beneath them, and her consciousness expanded to touch communication satellites across the globe. Her mother's final gift wasn't survival. It was the power to ensure no other child would endure what they had suffered. The data burst outward at the speed of light, carrying truth into every connected device on Earth. The electromagnetic surge peaked and suddenly cut off, leaving Elena's consciousness floating in a strange twilight between human awareness and something far more expansive. Her enhanced neural pathways still hummed with residual energy, but the desperate urgency of transmission had passed. The data was out there now, scattered across 10,000 servers, impossible to contain or destroy. "Elena?" Miguel's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she could feel his hand gripping hers. "Elena, can you hear me?" She opened her eyes to find herself lying in the medical chair, while the escape pod burrowed through solid granite with mechanical precision that vibrated through every surface. The electromagnetic drill ahead of them carved a tunnel at speeds that defied belief, powered by the same energy that had nearly destroyed her nervous system minutes earlier. "Status report," she managed, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. Her enhanced perception was still active but muted. no longer the overwhelming flood of input from the surface world. The kinetic strike hit 18 seconds after we dropped below minimum safe depth, Carlos reported from a console that had reconfigured itself for deep Earth navigation. Surface impact measured 8.7 on seismic sensors. Nothing up there survived. Elena felt her baby move with what seemed like relief, the frantic urgency replaced by steady, purposeful motion. The genetic modifications had protected them both, just as her enhanced cognition had predicted, but the transformation was far from complete. She could sense new capabilities developing in real time as their shared biology adapted to circumstances no human had ever experienced. "The broadcast?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer through residual connections to communication networks worldwide. Catherine looked up from a tablet displaying global news feeds, her expression mixing wonder with horror. Complete success. Every major news organization, government database, and social media platform on 6 continents received the full archive. They're calling it the largest intelligence leak in human history. Elena watched footage of coordinated raids striking facilities in 12 countries simultaneously. Children being led out of sterile research complexes, their faces showing the same confusion she remembered from her own childhood. Federal agents arresting construction executives whose connections to cartel money laundering were now front-page news across 3 languages. But the most startling images came from families like hers, ordinary people discovering that their entire lives had been orchestrated by programs that treated human beings like livestock. The breeding registry had contained over 300 active bloodlines, each carefully maintained for generations to produce specific genetic outcomes. "My God," Miguel breathed, reading classified files that were now public record. They had backup facilities on every continent. "Elena, if we hadn't triggered the global release..." 43 children would still be trapped, Elena finished, remembering the locations that had burned themselves into her enhanced memory, and their children after them. The escape pod's systems announced they had reached optimal depth, nearly 2 miles beneath the Cascade Mountains, in a geological layer that would remain stable for centuries. Emergency protocols had already begun converting the vessel into a permanent habitat, its fusion power core designed to sustain a small family indefinitely. Elena struggled to sit up, Miguel's hands steadying her as the regeneration matrix completed its final adjustments. The genetic modifications were stabilizing into something unprecedented, capabilities that belonged to neither parent's bloodline alone, but emerged from their unique combination. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, her tactical mind already processing their transformed circumstances. "The surface world thinks you're dead. Every intelligence agency on the planet will be hunting for survivors from the programs they just shut down." Elena looked at Miguel, seeing past the years of manipulation and betrayal to something more fundamental. The genetic modifications had enhanced her ability to read emotional truth, and beneath his exhaustion she found genuine devotion that transcended whatever programming had brought them together initially. "We raise our child," Elena said simply, "away from conspiracies and breeding programs and people who think they can engineer human destiny." Carlos pulled up architectural schematics of their new home. The escape pod had expanded into living quarters that could comfortably house a family, complete with hydroponic gardens, workshop spaces, and an advanced medical suite designed for the unique requirements of genetically modified physiology. "Your mother planned for everything," he marveled, reviewing supply manifests that anticipated decades of self-sufficient survival. Even educational programs for children with enhanced capabilities. Elena felt her baby respond to the word children with movements that seemed almost eager. The genetic modifications were creating possibilities Carmen Vasquez had dreamed of but never lived to see, a generation born free of the constraints that had defined their parents' existence. Above them, the old world continued its chaotic adjustment to revelations that would reshape international law and human rights doctrine for generations. But 2 miles below the surface, in a sanctuary carved from living rock by electromagnetic forces beyond conventional understanding, Elena Vasquez placed Miguel's hand on her belly and felt their child kick with the strength of someone who would never know what it meant to be anyone's experiment. The conspiracy was over. Their family was just beginning. 6 months beneath the earth had given Elena time to understand what she had become. The baby growing inside her wasn't just the product of genetic manipulation anymore. It was something entirely new, shaped by electromagnetic energies and choices that had rewritten the fundamental rules of human development. When labor began during the deep winter above, Elena felt her consciousness expand in ways the original modifications had never anticipated. Neural pathways are forming in real time, Miguel observed, monitoring both their vital signs from the medical suite's advanced scanners. His voice carried wonder tinged with protective anxiety. Elena, your brain is creating new connections as the baby develops. Elena gripped his hand as another contraction peaked, feeling their child's enhanced awareness touching hers through bonds that transcended biology. Above them, the surface world continued its transformation. The revelations from that November night had toppled governments and freed hundreds of children, but down here in their sanctuary carved from living stone, Elena understood she was giving birth to something the conspiracy's architects had never imagined, a truly free mind. She's ready, Elena whispered, enhanced perception reading biological signals with crystalline clarity. She wants to meet us. The birth itself defied everything Elena had expected. Her daughter emerged into their underground world, with eyes that tracked movement immediately, tiny hands that reached for light sources with purposeful coordination. The genetic modifications hadn't just enhanced her capabilities, they had accelerated her development in ways that made Elena's heart race with protective instinct. Sophia, Elena breathed, the name emerging from somewhere deeper than conscious choice. Her name is Sophia. Miguel's fingers traced their daughter's perfect features with reverence that made Elena remember why she had fallen in love with him before either of them understood what they really were. The manipulations had brought them together, but the electromagnetic transformation had burned away everything false, leaving only what they had chosen to become. She recognizes us, Miguel marveled, as Sophia's enhanced vision focused on each parent in turn, not just biologically. She knows who we are. Elena cradled her daughter against her chest, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat synchronizing with her own enhanced rhythms. The genetic modifications were already active in Sophia's developing nervous system, but without the trauma and programming that had defined their own childhoods. This was what her mother had truly been working toward. Not perfect operatives, but perfect freedom. Carlos knocked softly before entering their private quarters, his expression mixing joy with urgent concern. Elena, we're receiving communication requests from the surface. The congressional hearings have been ongoing for 3 months, but now they're asking for survivor testimony. Elena looked up from nursing Sophia, her enhanced cognition immediately processing the implications. The outside world had spent half a year dismantling the conspiracy networks she had exposed, but justice remained incomplete without voices from those who had lived through the programs. What kind of testimony? She asked, though part of her already understood. Her modified awareness could still touch satellite networks when she focused, feeling the electromagnetic signatures of a transformed world above. Direct victim impact statements, Carlos explained, pulling up transcripts on his tablet. They've identified 47 survivors from breeding programs worldwide. Most are willing to testify, but the committee says your case was the catalyst. Without your evidence, hundreds of other children would still be trapped, Elena finished, remembering the locations that had burned themselves into her enhanced memory during the transmission. Miguel, what do you think? Her husband studied their daughter's peaceful face, his own expression reflecting the internal struggle Elena recognized from her own thoughts. They had found safety in isolation, but justice required courage. We could testify remotely, Miguel suggested. The committee has secure transmission protocols, You wouldn't have to return to the surface. Elena felt Sophia respond to the tension in her voice with tiny movements that seemed almost reassuring. Her daughter would grow up in a world where the conspiracies had been exposed, where children with enhanced capabilities were protected by international law rather than exploited by shadow organizations. But that protection had come at the cost of hiding underground, while others fought for accountability above. Set up the connection, Elena decided, her enhanced perception reading truth in the steady rhythm of her daughter's heartbeat. But Carlos, I want visual confirmation of the other survivors. I need to know they're truly safe. As the secure transmission equipment powered up, Elena positioned herself so the Congressional Committee would see both her and Sophia clearly. Let them understand exactly what the conspiracy had tried to create and what it had produced instead. Not perfect weapons, but a family that had chosen love over programming. Members of the committee, Elena began, when the connection established, her voice carrying across 2 miles of stone to reach a hearing room in Washington. My name is Elena Vasquez. 6 months ago, I was 7 months pregnant and running for my life from people who wanted to turn my child into their experiment. Today, I'm a mother raising my daughter in freedom they never intended us to have. Through the camera, she watched senators leaning forward, their faces reflecting recognition that this testimony would reshape how the world understood both justice and hope. The new beginning. The transmission lasted 3 hours, but Elena's testimony reverberated across the surface world for months afterward. Through their secure connection, she watched the final congressional vote that established the International Protection Protocol for Genetically Enhanced Individuals, legislation that made what had happened to her family a crime against humanity. When the session ended and the screens went dark, Elena felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying finally lift from her shoulders. It's finished, Miguel said softly, his arm around her as Sophia slept peacefully in her enhanced carrier. Really finished this time. But Elena understood that what had ended above wasn't their story. It was their old life. Down here in their sanctuary 2 miles beneath the Cascades, they had built something entirely new. Spring came to the surface world while they established routines that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Sophia's enhanced development meant she was already responding to complex visual patterns and reaching for objects with startling coordination. Her first smile came at 6 weeks, followed by attempts at vocalization that sounded almost like words. She's processing language faster than the original modifications ever predicted, Elena observed, watching their daughter track conversations with obvious comprehension. Miguel, I think the electromagnetic exposure didn't just protect her, it accelerated everything. Their underground home had evolved too. The escape pod's emergency systems had expanded into living spaces that felt more like a research station than a bunker. Hydroponic gardens provided fresh food, while advanced fabrication units produced everything from clothing to sophisticated electronics. Elena's enhanced cognition had adapted to managing these systems with intuitive ease that surprised even her. But the real transformation was emotional. Miguel had become the father she had dreamed of during those terrifying nights in the old logging camp, his protective instincts balanced by genuine tenderness that had nothing to do with genetic programming. The manipulations that brought them together seemed distant now, replaced by choices they made fresh every day. Contact from the surface, Carlos announced one morning when Sophia was 4 months old. This one's different. Personal message from Catherine. Elena accepted the transmission, curious. Catherine's face appeared on their main screen, but behind her was something unexpected, a familiar landscape of mountains and forest. Elena, Catherine began, her expression mixing excitement with careful hope. I'm standing at the entrance to your old logging camp. The government has classified the entire area as a protected research zone, but there's something here I think you need to see. The camera panned across the moss-covered cabin where Elena had first discovered her mother's secrets, but now the structure had been carefully preserved, surrounded by new construction that looked official but respectful. They're building a memorial. Catherine continued. Not just for your mother, but for all the children who were lost to these programs. Elena, they want your permission to include Sophia's story, not as a victim, but as proof that the conspiracies failed. Elena felt Miguel's hand squeeze hers as she considered the request. Their daughter gurgled softly in her arms, enhanced vision tracking the images on screen with obvious interest. There's something else, Catherine added. 12 other families have been identified, survivors like you who chose to disappear rather than integrate back into the surface world. They're asking if you'd be willing to establish communication. Nothing that compromises your security, but children like Sophia shouldn't grow up completely alone, Elena finished, understanding immediately. Show me. The transmission shifted to display profiles of families scattered across 4 continents. Parents with enhanced capabilities raising children born free of the conspiracies that had defined previous generations. Each story was different, but Elena recognized the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her to the Oregon mountains. Could create a network, Miguel said thoughtfully. Secure communications, shared resources, educational programs designed for enhanced children. Elena looked down at Sophia, whose enhanced awareness seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Her daughter's eyes held intelligence that already surpassed normal infant development, but more importantly, they held curiosity about a world beyond their sanctuary. Catherine, Elena said finally, send the connection protocols, but make it clear, we're not hiding anymore. We're building something better. Over the following months, their underground home became the center of a growing network. Children with enhanced capabilities began learning together through quantum-encrypted connections. Parents who had fled in terror discovered communities of understanding. The conspiracy had tried to engineer perfect operatives, but instead had created families determined to raise children who would never know the fear their parents had endured. On Sophia's first birthday, Elena carried her daughter to the observation deck Miguel had constructed near their habitat's upper levels. Through reinforced transparencies, they could see the roots of ancient trees and the geological layers that protected their new world. Your grandmother started this, Elena whispered to Sophia, who responded with sounds that were definitely approaching words. She thought she was saving us from them, but we saved ourselves. Sophia reached toward the filtered sunlight streaming down from the surface, her enhanced coordination already remarkable. Elena understood that her daughter would eventually choose whether to live underground or return to the world above. But that choice would be made in freedom, true freedom that no conspiracy could ever steal again. The old Elena Vasquez had died in that logging camp, terrified and alone. The woman who remained had learned to transform terror into strength, manipulation into love, and a family born from conspiracy into something beautifully, perfectly free.